I never thought I'd be the type to believe in hauntings. I was raised practical, rational, and thoroughly skeptical. But what happened to me in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about the world and about what it can hold. It started when a friend of mine, Joe, invited me to go camping. Joe and I had been friends for years, ever since college, and the idea of a weekend escape sounded perfect. He'd heard about a remote spot in the mountains that promised peace, quiet, and pristine nature. It was the sort of place with no cell service, no cabins, and no one around for miles. Just you, the trees, and whatever might lurk in the shadows. We set out on a chilly Friday morning, hiking deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees around us were dense and tall, and even during the day, sunlight barely filtered down to the forest floor. The air was thick and damp, filled with the earthy smell of rotting leaves and moss. I remember Joe laughing as he spread out his arms, breathing it all in. Man, this is what it's all about, right? Getting away from everything. He had no idea how much we'd end up wanting to get away. By the time we reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. We found a clearing near a small, still pond, ringed by trees that loomed overhead like silent giants. Setting up camp was easy enough, and as night fell, we built a fire, sat back, and started sharing stories, just the two of us. The only sounds around were the crackling fire, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustle in the bushes. But at some point during the night, as the conversation started to lull, we heard something different. It was faint at first, almost like wind slipping through the trees, but too rhythmic, too human. It was a whisper, or at least it sounded like one. Just a single low voice drifting through the trees. Joe and I both froze, listening. We turned off our flashlights, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. The whisper was close, but we couldn't make out any words, just the steady, hushed tone, like someone speaking right under their breath. "You hear that?" Joe whispered, his face half illuminated by the dying fire. "Yeah," I whispered back, straining my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper who'd set up nearby, or the wind moving in some weird way through the forest. But as I kept listening, I started to feel strange. The whisper didn't come from a specific direction. It was all around us, like it was slipping through the trees and wrapping itself around us, coming closer and closer, until it felt like it was right in our ears. Joe grabbed a flashlight, clicking it on and swinging it toward the trees. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone there?" The whispering stopped immediately. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the hairs on my arms standing on end. For a moment I thought it was over. Maybe we'd just imagined it. But then we heard the laugh. It was soft and distant, barely more than a murmur. It wasn't cheerful, wasn't loud. It sounded like someone trying to stifle a chuckle, holding back a terrible, dark secret. Joe swung his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadow, and the endless, consuming darkness. The laugh echoed around us, fading in and out, like the woods themselves were playing with us, testing us. "We should go back," I whispered. But Joe was stubborn. He wasn't going to let a couple of weird sounds ruin his night. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind. He tossed a few more logs onto the fire, and we settled back in, pretending to ignore the growing tension that seemed to settle over us. It was around midnight when things got worse. I drifted off, curled up in my sleeping bag by the fire. But something jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open, and I immediately felt that something was wrong. The fire had died down to a dim glow, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. I looked around for Joe but couldn't see him anywhere. His sleeping bag was empty, neatly folded beside the fire. "Joe?" I whispered, feeling an icy prickle creep up my spine. No response. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to hear any sign of him. But the forest was dead silent. And then I heard it, the whispering, closer now, surrounding me. But this time I could almost make out words. They were fragmented, lost in the darkness. But they sounded pleading, desperate. I froze, trying to listen, trying to piece together what they were saying. Something about don't follow and can't come back. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, aiming it toward the trees where the whispers seemed to be coming from. I called out for Joe again, louder this time, hoping to God he'd answer. Instead, the whispering stopped, and then something spoke back. A voice, low, guttural, filled with something that felt wrong, something that made my skin crawl. It said my name, slowly, deliberately. My flashlight flickered, casting weak shadows that danced across the trees. My hands shook as I aimed it into the forest, and in that flickering light, I caught a glimpse of something impossible. There, just beyond the trees, stood a figure, tall, thin, and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its eyes wide and empty, glowing faintly in the darkness like embers. It didn't look human. It was stretched, distorted, like something that had tried to become human and failed. It took a step forward, the leaves crunching underfoot, and I heard that low, terrible laugh again. I staggered back, barely able to breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. And then it said my name again, softer this time, almost familiar. That's when I realized it was Joe's voice. But there was something horribly off, like the words were being forced, twisted by something else. I don't remember running. I don't remember gathering my things or even where I got the courage to turn my back on that thing in the trees. All I know is that one second I was frozen with fear, and the next I was tearing through the forest, sprinting as fast as I could, the whispering voices growing louder behind me, chasing me, begging me not to leave. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together, stretching into distorted shapes in the shadows. I kept hearing Joe's voice calling my name, sounding weaker and weaker, like he was being pulled farther away with every step I took. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Somehow I found the trail back to the main road. By the time I stumbled out of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I collapsed on the dirt, gasping for breath, feeling the cold, damp earth beneath me. And for the first time since that night began, there was silence. No whispers, no laughter, just silence. They never found Joe. I went back with search teams, retracing our steps, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. But there was no sign of him. No footprints, no camping gear. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, swallowed by the forest. Every once in a while, I think about going back, about finding that exact spot and waiting by the pond to see if he might return. But the thought always sends a shiver down my spine, that whisper of a memory brushing against the edges of my mind. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear him calling my name from the forest, his voice soft and pleading. And part of me knows that whatever is out there, it's waiting for me to come back. I've always loved the woods, the deep kind where civilization feels like a fading memory and everything is filtered through towering trees and the eerie calls of animals you can't quite place. Growing up in Oregon, forests were my playground. I thought I knew them better than anyone. At least that's what I'd always told myself. That confidence lasted until one autumn night when I encountered something that still haunts me. It was late October, the perfect season for a hiking trip. My friend Dave and I had mapped out a path that cut through an untouched stretch of forest near Crater Lake. This wasn't a standard trail. It was barely even known. We'd found it on an old map my grandfather had kept tucked away in a drawer labeled with a smudged handwritten name, The Vanishing Trail. It sounded more like a ghost story than a hike, but we couldn't resist. We packed our gear, our excitement buzzing with just a hint of unease. The first few hours were everything we'd hoped for. Crisp air, fiery leaves crunching underfoot, and the quiet that only comes when you're far from anyone else. It was serene, like stepping back in time. We stopped occasionally to take photos, share a flask of whiskey, and joke about the trail's spooky name. But around sunset, the mood started to shift. It began with the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the usual forest noise, branches creaking, small animals scurrying, the wind stirring the leaves. But soon I noticed something off about it. There was a rhythm, a strange cadence to the noises that seemed too purposeful, like footsteps. I turned to Dave, about to ask if he'd noticed it, but he just looked ahead, eyes narrowed. He must have felt it too. As darkness crept over us, we decided to set up camp in a small clearing. Dave built a fire, and we sat close, trying to shake off the growing unease. The sounds were still there, just beyond the firelight, rustling, snapping twigs, whispering. I leaned closer, straining to hear, and I swear I caught fragments of something, like voices speaking in low tones, slipping in and out of the silence. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Dave nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. It's like people talking. But there shouldn't have been anyone else out here. We hadn't seen another soul all day. Our signal was long gone by then too, so we couldn't check for news of nearby hikers or any updates about the trail. We just had to sit there, hoping the whispers would fade. They didn't. The voices got louder, more insistent, though we couldn't understand the words. They seemed to be circling us, coming from every direction. At one point, Dave muttered something about the fire. I glanced over, and my stomach dropped. The flames were turning an odd shade of green, casting a sickly glow over the clearing. It was as if the fire itself had caught some strange forest sickness, infected by whatever haunted the woods. Just then we heard footsteps. Not the soft padding of animals or the distant snap of twigs, but heavy, deliberate steps crunching closer. We grabbed our flashlights, pointing them toward the trees, and called out, but nobody answered. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a different sound. Breathing. Ragged, shallow breaths just a few feet from us, though we couldn't see anyone. In a panic, we kicked dirt over the fire and stumbled back onto the trail, deciding to move. We'd been in creepy situations before, but this was different. It felt like the forest was watching, waiting, somehow alive and resentful of our presence. Our instincts screamed at us to keep going, to get away. But as we started down the path, something bizarre happened. It was as if the trees had rearranged themselves. The trail had twisted, curving in directions it hadn't gone before. We checked our compass, but it spun wildly, useless. Even the stars seemed to shift above us, like the forest was bending reality, pulling us deeper into its trap. We kept moving, gripping each other's shoulders for support. The forest grew denser, the branches clawing at us like skeletal hands. Shadows shifted on the edge of our flashlight beams, darting too fast to catch but close enough to feel. I began to wonder if we were hallucinating, if maybe we'd gotten into some kind of forest fungus that was messing with our minds. But the fear in Dave's eyes told me he was seeing it too. Then we came across something that froze us in place, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was just barely visible, a black outline against the darkness, no more than a shadow but undeniably there. We couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, but we felt it watching us. Every instinct told me not to look away, not to give it the chance to move closer. But my body was trembling, and my flashlight wavered. The figure started to move, gliding closer, soundless. I couldn't bring myself to run. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze. Just as it was a breath away, something behind us snapped, breaking my trance. Dave grabbed my arm, and we bolted off the trail into the thick underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. We must have run for hours, branches whipping our faces, roots clawing at our ankles. Finally, we stumbled into another clearing and collapsed. The silence around us was suffocating. No rustling, no whispers, just the dreadful quiet. But then we noticed the ground. Scattered across the clearing were bits of old camping gear, decayed and rotting. Sleeping bags, torn backpacks, rusted tools. All signs of people who had been here before us, and all left in disarray. It looked like a graveyard of forgotten campers, a collection of belongings abandoned in a hurry. My stomach twisted as I realized how long some of these things had been here. Decades, maybe longer. Then, Dave spotted something that chilled me to the core. On the ground, beneath a tattered jacket, was a faded map, identical to the one we'd brought, bearing the same scrawled name, The Vanishing Trail. Are these the people who... Dave didn't answer. He just looked around, his eyes wide and unfocused, like he was in a trance. I grabbed his shoulder, shook him, but he wouldn't snap out of it. His gaze was fixed on something behind me. Slowly I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the trees. The shadow was back, only this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of dark figures stood around the clearing, silent, waiting. Their forms were indistinct, each one a blur of darkness and twisted limbs, as if they were unfinished, stuck between being human and something else entirely. They surrounded us, cutting off any path of escape, their hollow eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. I tried to pull Dave, tried to scream at him to run, but he just stared, his face pale and blank, as if he'd given up. The shadows closed in one by one, until they were inches from us, and then everything went dark. I woke up alone in the forest, lying on the cold ground, drenched in morning dew. My head throbbed, and my memory felt like shattered glass, fragments of images, sounds, but no clear sense of time. I was back near the start of the trail, though I didn't remember how I got there. Dave was gone. I called his name, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. In a daze, I stumbled back to civilization, back to a world that felt unreal after that night. I filed a missing persons report, combed through every article, every forum, looking for stories about the vanishing trail, but it was as if it didn't exist, erased from maps and memories alike. Every once in a while, though, I'll find something. A faded scrap of newspaper, a half-remembered rumor, a whispered warning in the back of a hiking guide. All of them hint at the same thing, a place in the woods where time and reality unravel, where trails lead nowhere, and shadows come to life. And somewhere, deep within, I know Dave's still out there, wandering the vanishing trail, lost forever in the forest's unending darkness. I remember the first time I heard about the hidden campground. It was one of those nights by the fire when someone just couldn't resist bringing up urban legends. Only this one wasn't just a legend, not according to the guy who told it to me. He swore he'd seen it with his own eyes, and something about his story planted a seed of curiosity I just couldn't shake. So, when I found myself out that way for a solo camping trip, I thought, why not check it out? The hidden campground was supposed to be deep in the woods somewhere off the usual trails, rumored to only show itself when it wanted to be found. People talked about it like some haunted house that moved from place to place, calling out to the unlucky who happened to stumble upon it. By dusk, I'd set up my tent and was just beginning to unwind. I couldn't resist the lure of the story, though, so I decided to go for a walk, just to see if maybe the place was real. It was dark under the canopy, even with the last streaks of sunlight, and the silence was different than usual. Not the soft rustle of wildlife, but a heavy, pressing quiet that felt like it was listening. I wandered deeper, maybe a little too deep, before realizing I'd left my flashlight back at camp. I should have turned around, but I felt like something was pulling me forward. The forest was thick with mist now, and there was this smell, like damp earth mixed with something rotting. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to some animal carcass nearby, but the smell only grew stronger. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, almost hidden by the trees. A small, clearing-like patch where the mist seemed to cling unnaturally. In the middle of it, there were the remains of a campsite, an old fire pit, a couple of moss-covered logs arranged around it, and a few torn, faded tarps hanging from low branches like sad ghosts. It looked abandoned, but fresh, like someone had just left in a hurry. The ground was littered with scraps, bits of fabric, broken camping gear, half-burnt food wrappers. But what really made me freeze was the sight of something glinting in the fire pit, a piece of jewelry. A gold locket, shining bright in the fading light. When I reached down to pick it up, I noticed the locket was still warm, as if someone had just been holding it. I flicked it open. Inside was a tiny faded photo of a young woman with an awkward smile, looking straight into the camera. Her eyes had this desperate look, like she knew something she couldn't say out loud. I felt an odd chill and slipped it into my pocket without really knowing why. Maybe a part of me felt that leaving it there would have been wrong, like abandoning someone in the middle of nowhere. I turned to leave, only to find that the path was gone. I'm talking completely vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The trees around me seemed thicker, closer. The mist now rolled over my feet, ankle deep, coiling around me like it wanted to keep me there. Panic began to gnaw at me, but I forced myself to take a few deep breaths and think rationally. I pulled out my phone to use as a light, but of course, I had no signal. Not wanting to waste the battery, I pocketed it again and started walking in the direction I thought I'd come from. That's when I heard it. A soft, low humming, almost like someone singing far off. I stood there listening. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet sorrowful, drifting through the trees like a siren's call. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized it was coming from the direction of the campsite. Against every bit of instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking back, drawn by the sound. The humming grew louder as I approached the campsite. Standing by the fire pit was a figure, half shrouded in mist. She looked almost like a regular woman, dressed in ragged clothes, her hair hanging in damp, tangled locks over her face. Her hands were clasped around something that glinted faintly in the dimness. I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that it was the locket I'd found. Before I could even move, she lifted her head, and our eyes met. Her face was gaunt, pale as death, but her eyes, they looked alive. Too alive, filled with a kind of hatred that made my skin crawl. She opened her mouth and let out a low, guttural wail that was nothing like the humming I'd heard before. It was a sound of pure anguish, like someone reliving the worst moment of their life over and over again. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root as I turned and ran. The mist seemed to part for her, letting her glide after me effortlessly. No matter how fast I ran, the humming crept back into my ears, chilling me to my core. I swore I could feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, feel her fingers just inches from grabbing me. When I finally burst back into my campsite, the forest was silent again. The mist was gone, and the oppressive quiet had lifted, leaving only the sound of my own gasping breaths. I threw myself into my tent, too shaken to even pack up. I didn't sleep a wink that night, every rustle of the leaves or creak of a branch sending my heart into a fresh panic. At dawn, I bolted from the tent and ran to the nearest road, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't look back until I was safely home, vowing I'd never set foot in those woods again. But it wasn't over. A few days later, I found something strange on my doorstep. A small package wrapped in faded brown paper. There was no return address, no note, just the package itself. With a sense of dread settling in my stomach, I tore it open. Inside was the locket, but it wasn't the same as before. The photo had changed. The woman's face was twisted in terror, eyes wide with the kind of fear that made me shiver. Her hand seemed to be reaching out, desperate, pleading. I threw the locket in a drawer and tried to forget about it, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the soft hum of that haunting melody coming from somewhere in the house. I moved not long after, sold almost everything I owned, including the locket, just to make sure whatever cursed thing I'd brought back didn't follow me. But every once in a while, when I'm alone and it's quiet, I hear that melody again. It's faint, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. I tell myself it's just the wind, or maybe my imagination. But deep down, I know she's still out there waiting for someone else to stumble onto her campground to find the locket. And if you ever come across it, run.